It's a pleasure to be here, and it's such a massive subject, localization. So before I get into the presentation, I know a lot of people here have worked overseas, and I want to just kind of, when I was thinking about this from a gender perspective, there was three things that came into my head. One is that you're at a checkpoint, and immediately you start thinking, how is this going to go? If it goes wrong, what I have on my side as an international aid worker is I have a logo. The media is going to get a hold of it eventually. I have the identity of the agency that I'm with. We have communications, we have cars. We're probably going to get out of it okay. And most local organisations don't have that. The second one was you're at a cluster meeting, at a coordination meeting. And for people who aren't familiar with the coordination mechanisms, you go to a meeting and there'll be an inner table, and then there will be a round of chairs on the outside of the room. And in many cluster meetings, UN agencies will take the inner table, and the NGOs will sit on the outside, and then it will be standing room only for everybody else. And so the power dynamics are put in place quite clearly in those kind of structures. And the third one is you're standing after a meeting with your country director, who may be a national, or you're with the senior national staff, and the expats will talk to the expats, and they won't address the national that's in your presence, who has far more experience. And so they're things that keep replicating themselves in so many contexts. And it just came into my head. I thought I just wanted to put that out there. So for Trócaire, we started looking at localization when we were engaged in the Irish Humanitarian Summit preparations for the World Humanitarian Summit. And we're signatories to the Charter for Change. And when we were at the summit, one of the things we were discussing quite frequently between ourselves, our executive director, Eamon Meehan, attended, and our country director from Myanmar attended, and we were really having conversations about the fact that it is about more than money. And okay, 25% by 2020 is fantastic. It's a huge achievement, a huge step forward, but the money itself isn't going to address all these other issues. So we started looking at how we were going to get a handle on this for ourselves primarily, and the motivation came from Myanmar, where we were looking at our work in Kachin, in northern Myanmar, and where we're very closely engaged with the local actors there, and huge amounts of support that we provide to the response, even though the local actors, our partners, are doing the response themselves. And we've never actively or adequately capture that in terms of, well, what is it that we bring to the table in a humanitarian response? And we knew it was about more than money, but how do you put it into something that you can explain and engage and so on? So we took on this research with Groupe URD, who are a French organisation, and we picked Myanmar and also DRC. And we probably had two different perspectives, which again, retrospectively is interesting, that we had Veronique and Francois did the Myanmar part of the trip, or the research, and myself and Veronique did the DRC part of the research. And when I was looking at it again from in thinking about this, it's quite interesting. The stuff that we picked up from DRC as two women was probably a bit deeper than what we picked up in Myanmar. The Myanmar element was quite structural in, funding mechanisms and so on, whereas in DRC, you'll see in the report there are more quotes on the frustration, on the really deep issues that local actors felt. And we spent quite a bit of time with local organisations, women's organisations in Ituri in DRC. So localisation, it's not new. And it isn't an either or, and I think that's important to put out there, that it isn't that an international response is not going to be required in many circumstances. It absolutely is, but there has to be a shift in how how responses work right now. And it doesn't mean that large scale responses won't be necessary, but it is about balancing it up and really having an understanding of what does it mean to be as local as possible and as international as necessary. And that's still a debate that's ongoing. And again, it's not, they're not new. The role of local actors, and as you said, where local actors are kind of pushed to the side, have come up in so many evaluations. from the tsunami to Haiyan to Ebola, more recently in Philippines, where partners felt that they were just, the coordination mechanism that was in place was really put to one side when the big machine, the international humanitarian response machine, moves into town. And that we explored that in quite a bit of detail in the research. Changing how aid happens. So local actors, and as you said, and I don't want to repeat, so I'll skip over some of these because I think you've touched on them already a little bit. So local first responders, the value that they have, knowing the context, speaking the language, and they'll be there long after the international actors go. That's not necessarily the case in many contexts where we work, where protracted crises are just running from one year into the next, and you're looking at 5-10 years of responses, which reinforces the argument for the humanitarian development nexus, which is also one of the work streams of the Grand Bargain, that if you are in a situation where there is no end to the crisis, it's going to keep rolling on, it's been rolling on for 5-10 years already, then how do we change the system? 1 year funding cycles is not going to do it. It's not going to help organizations to grow and build and fill up a space that international actors will fill as long as funding is available. And I mentioned, being stopped at a checkpoint there, but the reality is that local organizations face enormous risks. 90% of humanitarian workers in 2014 were local responders. And that came up very, very strongly in the research, was that the exposure of local actors to risk is absolutely enormous. And where we talk about approaches like remote control, where you have the expats of the INGOs sitting very far away from the front line, supposedly engaged in the implementation of the response, and this idea that by remote control, somebody else can take the risk and we go to the meetings. And it's not unnoticed that inequality, is there and it's real, and where international NGOs are more risk averse in 2017. Certainly from my own experience after 9/11, that risk aversion just got much, much worse, where agencies really felt that they just couldn't take as many risks. The situations were different, but then that risk wasn't mitigated. The risk was simply passed to national organizations. So where are the women? And it is a good question. And I think, there are enormous assumptions that if we address localization, that somehow it'll all just work out. If we, and women's organizations, women-led or women-centered, whichever it is, will somehow be part of the conversations. And of course it won't. Again, when I was thinking about this, the number of meetings that I've been at in my career where you have mansplaining. And not only do you have mansplaining happening, you have international actor splaining to a national organization who knows the context far better than we do. So we can't assume, I think, anyone that when we feel the inequalities ourselves, even though we have a huge advantage as international actors, we can only then assume, and rightly so, that national women-led or women in national organizations are going to feel exactly the same and worse in their work. And that came up in our research also. I would say that the World Humanitarian Summit did go some way to recognizing women as agents, which again, we're small steps, and not so much as victims, but as participants. But we haven't followed it through with the action, for sure. And discussing with my colleagues before this, we were looking at, you have copies of the women's empowerment research that Trocaire has done. And we looked at some of the words around agency and voice and control and power and the women's empowerment terminology. And you can take those words and really use them in the localization debate, also the localization conversation, because it is about agency, it is about voice, it's about control, absolute control from UN agencies to international NGOs to local actors, and it is like this. It's it's a top-down approach, and then power, and the power dynamics play both ways. Local authorities will have the power on whether or not organisations have access to programme participants or to affected areas in a crisis, and also we have enormous power on how the context is presented externally, when we do context analysis, and it's from our perspective 99% of the time. So like I said, the research was in Myanmar and DRC, and importantly we wanted to look at what we as Trócaire want to learn and need to change as an organisation that only works in partnership. We still felt that there were huge gaps in how we understand partnership in humanitarian crises. And then we felt that what we came up with would have benefit to the sector. So the research is structured, the main recommendations are very much for ourselves in Trócaire, and then there's some specific recommendations for the sector. And part of the debate we came up with our own definitions. And again, by process of discussion with colleagues and a huge range of actors in the two countries, but again it's around agency and power and voice, making localization as a collective process which gives a more central and important place to local actors. And even that we struggled with, that still the idea that we control it to give other people a space in our you can come to our party, and there's still an element of that. But I would also say that it's quite a Western attitude, that because if you look at where diaspora organisations and the Organisation of Islamic Council and the whole humanitarian movement that exists, much very separate to our Western coordination system. Like Turkish aid doesn't coordinate with the regular system. Many of the Islamic organizations don't coordinate because they coordinate separately and differently, and so we have this idea that we are the structure, but really we're not. We're one structure. So I think that's important also to bear that in mind. And again, like I mentioned, the humanitarian development nexus, resilience, that was what we came up with. We have a theory of change in the report, and that was where we ended up, was around how do you look at the resilience of communities, and how do you maintain the structures and the systems that they have before a crisis, and how do you help them to rebuild those. And we also would argue that instead of the humanitarian development nexus, that really it should be the development humanitarian nexus, because that's where people start in most contexts, where there's stability, and then a crisis happens. Okay, I really have to go quickly, right? So the experiences of partners, again, very quickly. The imbalance of power, challenging practical issues, IT, electricity, security, things like trying to put a program proposal together where there is no electricity, where you have no transport to get to a meeting. If you're not at the cluster meeting, your name isn't on the list, your chances of getting funding are reduced. And for national organisations, the costs of all those things were enormous. And so one of the things that we have recommended and would really advocate for is flexible funding, but the quality of funding is hugely important. It's how do we support local organisations to be able to train staff, keep staff, provide good HR mechanisms and systems, retain female staff, address some of the culture issues and intimidation and so on, address risk, help people have systems in place that will protect their staff, that you're not looking at a brain drain in a situation where you have national staff capacity going to work with the UN, and then the UN complaining about the capacity of national organisations and those kinds of things. I really will speed on. In the report, there's a statement from Julienne, from Sophie Paddy, who are a local NGO in DRC, and they spoke very powerfully about how they are humiliated on a regular basis. You know, they put in a budget and someone comes back and they've stripped out costs and flights and so on, and yet the budget is comparable to the annual cost of having a UN staff member in a country, and those kind of inequalities. In the research, the big issues were the tensions, funding and competition is also a big issue where international NGOs are competing for the same funding. The challenges of the sector, the treatment, respect, humanitarian principles, and then the humanitarian development nexus. So we touched on the cluster coordination, parallel coordination mechanisms. Also we looked at, this is my last point, I promise. We looked at where you have local authorities and the importance of local authorities in crisis, where the local authorities can be proactive and supportive and so on. And you'll see there's a section on capacity and will. And we looked at where local authorities may have great capacity and very little will to address the crisis, or they have very little capacity, but they have enormous will to work with organisations to address the crisis. And the recommendations are in the report. I think I'll just, the very last point I'll make is localising the localisation conversation. Again, we fall into our own trap. We've taken an international approach to dealing with the problem that we have identified and our way of solving it. And there's a huge space where we really need to work at country level to have the conversations with local actors and not be scared of it, because I think there's a real awkwardness in how we talk about money and things, and how do we address all of these issues that we've covered in the research. So thank you. Right.